Hello and welcome to this virtual roundtable, which we organize as a parallel event to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. I'm Johan Benizri, a member of the Executive Committee of the World Jewish Congress and the President of the Belgian Federation of Jewish Organizations. On behalf of the World Jewish Congress and the amazing team who put this panel discussion together, I would like to thank you all for your participation in today's discussion. Before we begin, please allow me to also thank the many organizations represented today who are taking actions in light of the horrific violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and the dire consequences that many civilians find themselves in. Our thoughts and prayers are with all those affected in this terrible conflict. Going back to today's discussion, please make no mistake, the irony of having a man, president of a faith-based organization, moderating an event on empowering women is not lost on me. My only hope is to be, as one of our panelists would truly put it, an effective ally in this cause. With this out of the way, and hopefully with me out of the way, let me open today's discussion. We are joined today by a fantastic and inspiring panel. Vicky Chebehar is a Colombian philanthropist and the Latin American Jewish Congress Commissioner for Gender Equality. She has done a lot for children in particular, especially in the fight against bullying and discrimination. She sits on the board of several organizations, including the Confederation of Jewish Communities of Colombia. Thank you, Vicky, for being with us today. Michelle King was previously Director of Inclusion at Netflix, and she was also head of UN Women's Global Innovation Coalition for Change. Michelle King is the host of a popular podcast called The Fix, and also the author of the best-selling book with the same name. She's a recognized expert on gender equality and organizational culture. She's a star really with a huge following, and we're thrilled to having her with us today. Thank you very much, Michelle, for being with us. And Dr. David Smith is the co-author of the book, Good Guys, How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. He's also associate professor at Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. Thank you very much, David, for being with us today. Without further ado, let me jump right in. And Michelle, if I may start with you so that we can get the discussion going. One of the things that I recognize, as a lawyer in a very large law firm, is that the corporate world has certainly evolved, and there's a lot of ways in which the corporate world tries to tackle gender equality issues and make good progress on gender diversity. What do you think are the key good practices, if any, that we could apply from the corporate world to faith-based organizations?
So this might be a slightly controversial answer, Johan. So firstly, I just want to thank you for having me here today. Such a privilege. And to David and Becky, so great to be joining you both.
Oh, you went on mute for some reason.
You know what? Apologies, everybody. That is the challenge of the year. I just want to firstly thank everybody for having me here today, and for Vicky and David for being a part of this fantastic. Johan, your question's so important because I think the reality is it's not actually true that we're great in terms of our progress around gender equality in corporations. And I think one of the reasons for that is we assume that common practice is best practice, which it's not. So I just want to explain what I mean by that. A McKinsey study finds that workplaces are becoming more diverse but less inclusive. And one of the reasons is we don't value the diversity we bring into organizations. So I think one of the best practices that organizations can take up is recognizing it's not enough to hire women into organizations. We need to value the strengths and capabilities and diversity that women bring into organizations. And to do that, we need to create environments that truly value the capabilities women have, what I call, cultures that really value difference. And creating that type of environment requires every single one of us understanding how our behaviors, how our micro practices, our small behaviors we engage in every day create macro cultures or macro changes in our workplace. You know, and every manager understanding what are the barriers women encounter, what are the challenges that, you know, women experience, what is my role, what are the behaviors I need to take to remove some of those challenges. And what I'd encourage everybody to do is to think about, you know, in your workplace, how many people understand inequality? How many people even understand how inequality works? And how many people know what actions they need to take every day to create a culture that values difference? And this, I think the whole framing of the problem as one that's women's is really the problem we need to fix. We need to recognize why it is that gender inequality, you know, really costs men, and why men need to understand how to value difference arguably more than women. And for me, there's this reframe that needs to happen in how we even ask that question. So the starting point is to recognize common practice isn't best practice. A lot of DEI initiatives actually haven't worked. We're currently focused on diversity, not inclusion side of the equation. And we need to create cultures that truly value women, which start with understanding how every single one of us contributes to that by the behaviors we engage in. So for me, that would be the starting point for really recognizing it. And then finally, you know, why everybody stands to benefit from this.
Very interesting. I kind of expected that type of answer, because I do recognize that common practices are not yet at the level that we want, and it's often subpar. But maybe to make it even more concrete and personal, I'll turn to Vicky for a minute. What has the biggest challenge? What has been the biggest challenge for you in your journey to make changes when it comes to gender inclusion?
Thank you, Johan, and thank you for inviting me in this panel, and everyone for connecting. For me, you know, this advocacy for gender equality came late in my life. You know, growing up and in community leadership programs, I never really faced that discrimination. So one day I wake up with like the door slammed in my face. And this was about 5-6 years ago. And the biggest challenge was just my frustration. I think I was a little bit immature and feeling like just so mad. And I didn't have that patience to zoom out and say, what is really going on? I think, you know, now with COVID and that whole understanding of the fear of change and the fear of just the unknown really taught me a little bit of what is behind that discrimination, which not that I'm going to stop advocating or fighting, you know, for a change, but I think it was just my personal emotional blockage of not being able to see the big picture and getting stuck in not really feeling I should answer somebody asking me, you know, I don't understand why women need, you know, a voice at the table. And I would just get stuck emotionally. So that was really the biggest challenge I had to overcome in this journey that I'm taking.
Yeah, and just to open it with another question, maybe for you, David. You know, Michelle just said that, you know, it's clearly not a question of just women, and for women to take this issue forward is simply not enough, and probably certainly not best practice. Could you maybe explain to the audience and to me also, why are men so important to solving for equality, equity, and inclusion in the workplace?
Yeah, thanks again, Johan, for having me today. It's great to be here with two superstars here, with Vicky and Michelle, you know, in this great conversation today. And yeah, and I think it's a great question, and one that we've been focused on in terms of how do we, you know, gender equality and gender equity, and just by definition means that we all need to be involved in doing this work, right? And I think too often when we think about gender equity or gender equality, I think too often these are labeled as women's issues. And so the solutions end up going focused on women. So a women's leadership program, for example. Whereas if we reframe these as, you know, these are not just, they are gender issues, but they're not women's issues. These are leadership issues that we all have in all the different types of organizations that we're in today. That means that we all have a role and a function there. So men have a role and a function, because I think too often men have looked at these and said, it's a women's leadership program, or it's a women's issue. What's my role there? I don't have one. And so they don't get engaged in doing the work. And so for decades, women have made incredible strides toward creating equity and equality in the workplace, and just, you know, again, significant changes up through the turn of the millennium. But really over the last 20 years, we really have made very incremental and really small changes in terms of trying to achieve equity in the workplace. And largely because there just wasn't that much more to be done that women hadn't already done without men being engaged in doing this work. And so one of the things that we need to do is we've got to begin to think about, again, for men to be engaged in doing this, how do we get them and why aren't they engaged as often? Because, you know, the research that we've done, we find that it's probably no surprise that a lot of men believe in gender equity, and maybe most of the men that are on this call, hopefully today, believe in it as well. But just because you believe in something doesn't mean you actually achieve the outcomes. We're not achieving the results that we're looking for that create equity and parity in the organizations that we're in. So why is that? Well, because sometimes we overestimate how much we're really doing to achieve equity in the workplace. So the types of best practices out there, maybe they're just not as good as we think they are. And in other cases, we just don't have the awareness. I think back to what Michelle was talking about, we don't understand how people who are different from us experience things differently in the workplace. And it's really hard if you don't understand this, you don't have empathy and awareness around this, it's really hard to fix problems you can't see or don't understand. And so I think bringing some awareness to this, and then I think it's the underlying part of this, is really helpful to engage people, to motivate people to do the work that we know that needs to get done. So if we're actually going to get beyond where we are today, and I think the estimates out there toward getting to things like reducing the gender wage gap and recreating equity in the workplace are over 200 years. If we're going to move faster than that, we've got to all be involved in doing the work.
No, absolutely. One thing that always puzzled me, though, was the place of men as allies is incredibly important, for sure. The question really is, how does it interact with women's specific issues with some men, or with, you know, the place of men in the workplace? Michelle or Vicky, have you experienced any type of unease when it comes to men allyship?
I would love to answer this if that's okay, Vicky, and feel free to jump in. I feel like this could be a whole talk, Johan, so I'm just going to try and keep my rant brief. But I think the starting point is actually the framing of what the role of men is, because I think the framing of allies can be quite problematic, and terms matter because it sets up this frame that somehow men are helping women. And I'll be honest, I don't need your help. I need you to solve the inequality that you create and understand why doing that actually serves to benefit you. So a good example of this is every time I hear, you know, we need a business case for change. That's so offensive because there's no business case for the status quo. And if there was asked for one, we probably wouldn't be able to produce one because there is so much research that shows more diverse, more inclusive workplaces are simply better workplaces in terms of productivity, financial performance, agility, innovation, you name it. Businesses need diversity. I think for me, this whole focus on the why, what we haven't reduced that to is the personal case for change. So are men clear why it is that building workplaces where you can be yourself and be valued for that ultimately serve to benefit you? And if you cannot finish that sentence, a more equal workplace serves to benefit me because you haven't done the work to recognize that our success is tied. Our success is tied in our ability to create a work environment that values difference, because in that work environment, you are much more likely to be yourself. You're 6 times more likely to innovate. You're more likely to collaborate. You're more likely to problem solve collectively and achieve better business outcomes for your own advancement. And so, you know, I always quote this Accenture study that's shown over the last 10 years, you create an environment that values difference, men are twice as likely to advance to senior leadership positions. And that's because organizations are not designed in a way to devalue difference. Suddenly we're opening it up so more men who might do things in a maybe less traditional masculine way have opportunities to advance. And the final thing I want to say is, you know, a lot of my research has shown that men really believe the number one barrier to their advancement at work are diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives focused on women. And we have failed men, DI initiatives have failed men. We've presented this case that it's win-lose. We've presented this whole orientation that somehow advancing women comes at a cost to men. It doesn't. more equal workplaces benefit every single one of us. And the starting point for tackling it and being a real success partner to each other, whether you're male, female, regardless of your gender orientation, starts with recognizing why every single person deserves a workplace that values difference and how it will benefit them. So for me, I think the personal case for change for men is missing. We haven't articulated why, and we have almost next to no initiatives, aside from all of David's amazing work, in corporations that really focus on helping men understand why the status quo costs them. Men currently have 1 out of the 5 capabilities required in the future world of work, and women have 4 out of 5. And that means women are more equipped today in the way they lead, which is much more transformational on average than men, to really survive and thrive in the future, where men are handcuffed to some 1950s transactional command and control way of leading that doesn't serve them today and won't serve them in the future. So we need to help men understand why they need to be free to be themselves and be valued for that, and how to do that, and how to create an environment that values their capabilities. So for me, that's what this is about. And I think we miss that in a lot of the ways that we approach this today.
Very interesting. It's as if the intention was as important, if not more important, than the actual work. Being an ally is also understanding why you want to be an ally. And certainly not why it would be interesting for you to be an ally. Very, very interesting. Vicky, have you experienced that type of tension or unease when kind of men helping?
Of course. My perspective is more faith-based, which is community serving. So the impact I see is definitely that word help is something that we need to change. You're not helping us. We have to help each other be better leaders. And we're seeing the numbers of not doing that. We're seeing, like they're talking about the Great Resignation. You're also seeing, the young people leaving religion. How can we allow that to happen? So we don't need to be helped. And the men feeling that by saying thank you so many times, that's doing their job. I do believe that our real allies sometimes lack the skills to know how to make that change. And that's where David's work is so important. I felt like my real allies, the ones that understand that we need to work together in order to better serve our communities, because it's in the numbers. We're not serving them. People are leaving. We're being irrelevant in our leadership. Those men that I've identified as the years have gone by and kind of like my outrage has gone down, they just lack the skills. They're like, okay, we're on board. What do we do? They're also very intimidated because the loud ones, they're usually a minority, but they make the most noise, and it borderlines on aggression. And nobody really wants to sit in front of aggression and stand up to bully. A lot of my parenting coaching skills kick in a little bit there, because you talk about bullying kids, but we're being bullied at our leadership tables in our communities. So I think I'm super grateful that people like David are coming out and teaching these skills to men that are saying, we definitely need this. This is the impact we need in order to better serve our communities. And let's stop saying thank you so much. And let's stop saying I'll help you. Let's get to work, get back to the drawing table, become relevant. And how do we serve our communities in a way that they're going to come in and not leave to spaces where they feel they have more shared values than our faith-based communities, apparently.
We are already getting a number of questions throughout various channels, but before I turn to those questions, and we will turn to them, I wanted to ask David, maybe again in this section about allyship, what motivated you to start thinking about this, to research this, to think about leadership in those terms?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think this is one that hopefully, again, a lot of the men on the call today listening to this will take heed of, because when you start doing the work around and you start talking about gender equity and doing this kind of work and being a great ally, I think women often will look at you and maybe with a little skepticism and maybe critically, because they've learned that, again, what people think of what it means to be an ally and to do this work isn't always what it needs to be. And so I think having your why ready to go and being clear about what that is really important. And I think the more senior you become in an organization, for senior leaders who are often very uncomfortable talking about things like diversity and gender and race, that again, they need to have their why ready to go. So my personal narrative around this is, it started, my first career was in the military as a Navy pilot. And, my partner, my wife, was also had a career in the Navy as well. And, early on in our careers, we used to have a lot of great conversations about what we were experiencing in the workplace. And I just remember I would just kind of shake my head in disbelief sometimes with the things she would tell me about what she was experiencing. And because I never saw that. I never had that experience in the workplace. Things were very different for me. And if I needed an answer, I needed a mentor, I needed support for something, or I had to find some career guidance on anything, I didn't have to look very far. It was usually right there at my feet. And I just had to look down and understand what it was. For her, that wasn't the case. And I just remember thinking to myself that, wow, this is just, it got into that sense of fairness and justice I think a lot of us have when somebody you know and you care about is experiencing things like this. And I look back into my own workplace and it's like curious, are other women that I work with experiencing these same things? And that's where then I started to make the connection to how this is broader. These aren't individual, they are experienced individually, but they're systemic. There are things that are going on broadly in our society and in our organizations out there. And so that was kind of the first time I ever thought about this. Of course, that personal connection is something that most people use to get in touch with that motivation to do this work. And I think it's important to recognize where people are when they have their own personal narrative about why this is important to them. But my research is also focused on the area of gender, work, and family. And so I've been looked at the research in terms of the inequities and my own research as well, and how women experience this. And it really, I think, motivates you to find not just theoretical ideas and solutions about this. Again, in the broader workplace, sometimes this is just the nice talk that we often hear about creating equity, but actually find real practical application for this. And that's where, the research we've done over the last decade on this topic has been focused on that. It's not here just to tell a nice story. No, we want to create the change that we're looking for. We want to equip people, in this case, specifically men, to collaborate, to partner with women to create the change that we need and we're looking for. And again, I think this is really important that the men on the call today, they think about their own personal narrative so they can share this, but also think about how do you connect this back into the business and the specific business outcomes that are so critically important to your organization, whatever it is that you do out there, because this is where we're going to make the real change that Michelle and Vicki are articulating here, the real change that we're looking for. And it's going to benefit not just women, it benefits men, and it benefits the organization, our society broadly. So again, I think there's a lot of great motivation to get started and get doing this work right now.
Well, and you're talking about creating change, which I think is very inspiring to many of the audience today. The one thing that I'm wondering, and maybe you can all comment on that, is whether we need to define the culture in which we want to affect change. So in a corporate environment, I can imagine that there are many different corporate environments. It's not just a single, change that you can apply indistinctly everywhere. And at the same time, there are certainly things that you could transfer from one environment to another. Can you, and because we're talking about also faith-based organizations, I'd like to understand whether there are cultural frameworks that would be essential to understand before we can create the change and before we talk about tips and tricks and so on. Michelle, do you want to first take that?
I think for me, so I work with a lot of organizations now around the world, trying to build cultures that value difference. And I have sort of a theory of change I've developed as part of my own research and doing my PhD. And what's really interesting is I think what I found pretty consistently is organizations are very quick to jump to solutions. So we're actually quite good at disrupting denial and becoming aware of inequality. I think post-Me Too, post-anti-racism work, particularly in the United States, it had a global effect. And we saw a lot of organizations running sort of anti-sexism, anti-racism sessions with employees. So huge amount of awareness raising. around how inequality is showing up, but very little understanding as to how does that apply in work contexts and what does it look like in terms of an organization. And I think understanding that is really about understanding the lived experience. So the starting point is understanding, what are the most common barriers, what I call sort of the lived experience of inequality. It's not enough to be aware of biases. And in fact, often being aware of it can reinforce them. It's really about understanding how is it showing up every day to create barriers of lived experiences of inequality for the people you work with. And it's really important actually to understand that from an intersectional lens. So understand, gender is just one identity. There's multiple identities and they can come together to create different lived experiences of inequality. So researching, understanding, learning about how this is showing up in your workplace is a starting point. David's book is a great book to read, and it really addresses it from a male perspective. I've got a book where I identify 17 barriers for women, 6 for men. My work now has gone on to look at all areas of difference and what are the most common barriers based on the research we have. So that understanding, absolutely critical. And the reason it's critical is because without it, what happens is we jump to common practice. So we jump to, well, let's just change a policy. Let's just tweak a process. Let's just implement another women fixing initiative. And what that does is create, number one, it's not addressing the problem we're trying to solve for. So a lot of us aren't clear on the problem, like how does inequality work at work? And the second thing is it does nothing to really, enroll all individuals in it. So it looks like the zero-sum game. We're back at that again because we focus on women rather than the environments and how you value difference. So for me, I did some research with the Society of Human Resource Management in the United States, surveyed 835 HR executives and found nearly all the most common go-to DEI strategies for changing culture, like unconscious bias training, flexible workplace, maternity leave, all of it. HR executives know are only slightly effective at best, but they are still the go-to initiatives. And the reason for that is we haven't done the work to understand how do we create a lived experience for people where they feel valued. So for me, the model really is absolutely disrupt denial, become aware, but do the real work of understanding how is this showing up. So a great practical tip for any leader who's watching this is sit down with your people tomorrow and ask them these 5 questions. What does inequality look like in our team? What would a culture that values difference look like? What are 2 to 3 things we can do in the next 12 months to create that type of environment? What am I not doing as a leader to create that environment? And what do I need to start doing? And if every leader did that, you begin the journey of understanding how is this showing up in my work environment and what can we collectively do to take action? Because jumping to action without understanding and doing the real work of educating people on the barriers is the problem we have to solve for. So for me, that is really the journey that every organization's on. And I just want to really hammer home the culture point, because you can hire all the diversity you want into your organization, but if it's not inclusive, there's no point. And a good example of this is that MIT study that came out showing that culture is 10 times more predictive of turnover than compensation. And that is because, individuals want environments, to Vicky's point, the Great Resignation points to this, that really value difference. So we have to understand how to do that. And investing in understanding is the starting point.
Yeah, I think you may have a view on this as well. And I think it would be great if you could also take us to the faith-based organizations and how, you see that in faith-based organizations as well. Yes.
I'll jump in that one. I think it's really interesting that talking about culture and faith-based, my particular experience is I work as well in the table that works with anti-Semitism in Colombia. So we really have a culture of anti-discrimination when it comes to religion, just not only Jewish religion, but we've just been advocates in the country. And I see when there's a situation of discrimination of religion in our community, and you hear words like it's urgent or immediate, or you have to be forceful, right? But when we're talking about discrimination against women in a different table, it's like, no, you have to have patience and calm down, and it takes time. So it's like, discrimination is discrimination. Why do you suddenly transfer the volume of, and clearly the reason is because the people making this decision are men, and for them, it's not so urgent when you discriminate women because they're not feeling it. So that part of the culture to me has been really interesting in understanding how it changes so much being discrimination against women or against religious in the country. It's a vast difference. And the challenge as well in the word culture and faith-based, I believe, is that when you feel when they felt, this has been my experience, you're changing something in the administrative, like having women on boards, there's that fear that the culture, the tradition of culture we're trying to preserve in our faith-based organizations is going to change. So how do you kind of dissect it and say, okay, what is our purpose? How do we remember, recognize, and go back to see what our purpose is? How are we serving our community through this purpose? And are these changes really going to be getting in the way, or actually probably allowing this faith-based organization to be relevant and strengthen the purpose? So when you talk about culture, it depends on the table you sit at, it's going to have a different meaning. And for me, really, particularly, it's like, when sometimes it could be helpful when I'm talking about our religious culture and how these changes will for sure get us towards being able to protect it, as opposed to the culture that they feel will be lost if we make changes as allowing women to have it, to be sitting on the tables that make decisions.
Yes, and hearing you, it seems that we're still circling around this issue of having, most of the time, male leaders not understanding the problem, not really taking it at heart, not understanding it, not having the right intentions. So I guess I'm going to turn back to David again and say, what are the key motivators that we could bring to the table in leadership with men trying to do the right thing, or at least having the right mindset? Because as you said in the beginning, most men do believe in equity and equality, and so what is it that we could do to try and motivate them to go in the right direction?
Yeah, and I think that's the $1 million question, right? maybe even more. But and so there are some things that we know that do work, and the question is, can you extrapolate this to some higher order, some higher level, right? Beyond right now, it's really working in small groups and individuals, but really it's back to opening people's eyes to this awareness aspect and really beginning to have them understand this. So as you begin to understand, then you can begin to see where the action is to take that, to start beginning to do that work. And I think that remembering that lots of people, we're all on this journey together, and recognizing we're in different places. And that's one of the other challenges to motivating people, because it's not one size fits all here, that people are in different places. And, we're focused today on gender diversity. Well, I could be in a very different place when it comes to racial diversity or other forms of diversity, religious diversity. And again, recognizing that, that people don't have just one identity either, that we have intersecting identities. And that's important too, as we think about, for example, women of color may have a very different experience, and we have to take that into consideration as well. And so this is not as easy as we'd like it to be, I think, in terms of moving forward. But one of the things I think that really works well, and Michelle does a really nice job of highlighting this, and this is the benefits for everyone, right? Not just women, but benefits for men in this. And Brad and I, my co-author, Brad Johnson, and I talk to men about this all the time, because I think this is the self-interest piece that, again, it can be a motivator to do this and become better as leaders, become more effective, to be better partners, parents, people, and all of these things are part of that. That, we find that when, for example, when men have more relationships with women in the workplace, so more professional relationships, and it tends to open their eyes to other perspectives, and it opens their eyes to other ways of leading. And again, this gets to what Michelle was talking about in terms of, looking at valuing what women bring in terms of their leadership style, and that, there's a more diverse perspective of what men have when it comes to leadership as well, and valuing all of those aspects, and knowing that, again, those are some of those things that are going to make us more successful. And I think looking at things like humility and empathy and authenticity and vulnerability, those are things that, there was a recent research that showed that 62% of CEOs today have those qualities. So we know that those are things that are valuable in getting people to the top. How do we take that and push that through the rest of the organization? And I think beginning to have men and understand what that looks like. And so on an individual basis, these relationships that we have, if we have more of these closer relationships with women in the workplace, that we see some of the benefits of things like increased access to information, more diverse networks, and then enhanced interpersonal skills. So more empathy, higher EQ, better communication skills, all things that make us better leaders. Again, things that we want, but it also makes us better people, better partners, better parents. And so we can extrapolate that out into other forms of our lives. And so again, this motivation piece I think is really important. But I think we also have to recognize that there are things that are holding men back. And you know, I'd like to just wave my hand and say they're not there, but they are. And that we have to acknowledge those and then address them for men. And there's a lot of those. And the unconscious biases and the implicit perceptions and how we see, having men acknowledge and understand that this is one of the things that is holding us back, is how we see women when they are in positions of power, when they are influencing the change in our organizations. And again, how are we, by these implicit perceptions, holding them back? The anxiety that we have sometimes as men, and certainly, you know, some of this has been exacerbated in the post-Me Too world, anxiety about having these relationships with women in the workplace in the same way that we do with our male colleagues, and understanding what that looks like. And, you know, and as I said before, Me Too was much needed, but I think there's been some unintended consequences that men have perpetuated in terms of kind of these false narratives that we see and we hear all the time, that somehow now in the post-Me Too world, women are scary to work with, or that women caused Me Too, or my favorite, that no, I'm going to get Me Too'd, using Me Too as a verb, if I have relationships with women. They're going to, in other words, they're going to make false accusations about sexual harassment. There's no research to back any of that up. There's no evidence of this, right? These are just things that we as men we perpetuate these in our own circles, and we need to stop that and call it out when we hear it. Some of this is just remembering that, hey, women, what Me Too was all about was women just asking to come to the workplace and not be harassed or assaulted. I mean, it's a really low bar for us as guys to get over, and we can do a lot better than that. But I think remembering what that's all about, and then getting past some of that so that we can enjoy the benefits of what we're trying to create in the workplace overall.
So part of the issue that you're highlighting is also kind of men being on the defensive, right? You know, trying to turn a number of conversations to be about them. And I'm wondering also, you know, Vicky or Michelle, if you could say a few words about also the reluctance of men to recognize that they are in privileged positions, or that they have been put in privileged positions over the years. You know, this idea of being on the defensive is not only when men seem to feel to be attacked. It's also sometimes recognizing their own positions as the result of merit rather than, you know, circumstances or sometimes luck.
I'm happy to share. So my research has actually coined a term for this. It's called gender denial. And what it looks like is you believe your experience is the only experience of working life. You believe that workplaces are meritocracies, that they function for everybody in the same way, that you treat everybody in the same way, that, you know, this idea that your position is somehow neutral. And it's actually not unique to men. We're actually all in denial to some extent around the way in which workplaces are gendered and how that creates different lived experiences of the organization. But for me, the starting point is actually recognizing you might be in denial. And so some people will be listening to this and getting really irritated by what I'm saying. And it's good. I want you to be irritated, because that's this disruption process of recognizing just because your workplace works for you doesn't mean it works for everybody else in the same way. And success discriminates in organizations, and it discriminates based on who really fits the shared perception of what good looks like. And what does research tell us? Over the last 30 years, if you all close your eyes and think about what does good look like in terms of competence, in terms of leadership capabilities, you're going to think of a white, middle-class, heterosexual, able-bodied male. But way more importantly than demographic characteristics, you're going to think of someone who is dominant, assertive, aggressive, competitive, exclusionary, someone who's willing to commit all their time to the organization. And the problem with this is that is a shared perception for competence and leadership. So the more you differ from it, the more experiences of inequality you're going to encounter. And that is why success discriminates. You know, as a woman, you can do everything exactly right and still not succeed because organizations simply devalue your difference. So our job is to recognize if your workplace has worked for you, great, but recognize it might not work for everybody else in the same way. And that privilege is really just the unearned benefit of fitting that standard of what good looks like by default through no effort on your part. And so for me, I'm not really interested in privilege. I'm interested in how individuals, if that's an unearned benefit you get of just fitting that standard, for me, my whiteness, I fit that standard. And so that means, you know, race is never going to be a barrier for me to have to overcome in workplaces. So how do I spend that unearned benefit, that privilege, by taking action to create workplaces that value difference? And that's by building my awareness of the problem we're trying to solve, building my understanding of other people's lived experiences, and then taking action every day to tackle the moments where we devalue that difference, those inequality moments that show up at work. And, you know, David shared a really important point earlier about that idea of intersectionality. Well, what does that mean really for individuals? It means treat every person like a person and recognize that your experience isn't their experience. And in my research, too many men believe that workplaces work for everybody in the same way, and disrupting that denial is critical. But I want to point something out for women watching this. Women are in denial about men's lived experiences. So as a researcher, I assumed that this all works for men, and I didn't realize it doesn't. I take a year out of my research just to focus on men's lived experiences. And what I found is living up to that ideal really costs men. It may have worked back in the 1950s when that style might have worked, but it doesn't work today and it won't work in the future. And there are so many different challenges men encounter for having to live up to that outdated ideal. So I just want everyone to recognize disrupting denial is actually our shared problem to solve for.
Vicky, in terms of gender denial in faith-based organizations, and particularly the ones that you're dealing with, must be a real issue, isn't it?
Well, I think, I mean, for me personally, I think it's harder because it's not like they don't realize it, but they think they're doing us a favor. Like, you don't worry. We're going to, take these really tough positions and allow you to stay home and cook more. It's like, really, like, if we should be saying thank you to them for, just taking up all those spaces, because we really can't multitask, right? So that's something that's been really tough, going back at my first challenge where I've had those moments where I'm like, no, I can't really believe I'm hearing this, right? And what happens, and Michelle really speaks a lot about this. This isn't just leaving women out of these spaces, but what about the men, right? So you see, like, families have evolved and men spend much more time. They want to spend more time with their families. They take more part in their parenting. They sit and they want to have dinner, with their family. And that's something that for them, it's even harder because you're leaving them out of that table, because it's much harder for a man to say, you know what, I think like 6 o'clock meetings are tough because I want to be with my family. That taboo, they're going to be looked at. And Michelle said it, like, you're weak. You don't really take this so seriously. So I think in faith-based organizations, and I can't speak to all of them, I've really mainly worked in Jewish communities. It's that, the bylaws and the structure was made for men by men in, the 1940s, where at that moment it reflected the family structure. It was probably very compassionate, right? Fast forward to 2022, you look at them and it's like, no. And that's why they're not leaving. I don't feel they're leaving the religion. They're just seeing these religious institutions being so irrelevant to their values. It's a place where you have to choose. A man has to choose whether or not he's going to be, taking part in his family or sitting in those tables. So I think this discrimination of women discriminates men in the spaces they're taking in the family. And it's really important to recognize that it's probably easier for us as women. We've already been tagged as like aggressive or fighters, and it is harder for men to stand up for themselves in those spaces because they will be seen as weak, right? So opening those spaces and redoing, as I said, not sitting at the table, not inviting us to sit at the table. We have to just, create another space, because those tables are obsolete. And you're seeing not only, like the average age of people sitting in faith-based boards, there's no rotation. The people who are there, and they're not being able to attract young people, men or women, because they're so set up on those like mindset of the men taking care of the women and just, you know, leading so that they're doing the good for society and not understanding, seeing the numbers, what it's doing for our community. So, you know, it definitely is a struggle.
I probably want to go back still to this idea of merit and gender denial. All of this is super interesting. And particularly to me, I read a book by Michael Sandel called The Tyranny of Merit, where he makes the point that a lot of our positions, our ways, our successes are really a factor of genetics and luck. And, you know, the one thing that he finds people are more resistant of is not the idea of gender equality or diversity, but rather this idea there that the position they hold is not their own doing, is not the result of their own doing. Do you think there's a place for this discussion to promote equality, to try and deconstruct this idea of a meritocratic ideal? David, maybe?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this. I think, again, the research around meritocracies is really interesting. And I think there is definitely a place for this in this conversation. It's not the only part of it, but it's definitely a part, you know, one that's important. You know, so one of the things we know about meritocracies, right, or at least organizations that have meritocratic values and ideals, right? We believe in the fact that people, you know, they rise up based on their own merit. It's objective, it's measured, and there's no bias. And that's the flaw, right, in it, that there's an assumption that's made there in a meritocratic organization that there is no bias. And this is the challenge, is that if you assume there's no bias in the processes and the everyday practices we have that are important, right, to the adding value to the organization, which includes promoting people, putting people in the right positions, all of these things that we do every day, guess what? You know, we're not going to look for it, and it's there, and it's operating. So it's actually one of the more challenging things, and this is part of probably the tyranny part of what you were reading there of meritocracy, is that, yeah, if I think I'm in a meritocratic organization, I'm not going looking for bias, and I probably don't have anything in place intervention wise to stop it or to create a check and balance to it. But the minute you start to question it, you know, then we can find it in the system every day. And certainly this is part of the systemic change that we're looking for in our organizations. And so, you know, some of the research I do is around performance evaluations and performance reviews, looking at bias there. And so if you want an example of what it looks like in everyday practice, you know, women's leadership, I think we heard it from Vicki and from Michelle today. Women's leadership gets questioned in a variety of different ways. And it's because the minute they're in a position of power or influence, that we begin to question their competence and their agency, their ability to wield or use power in that way. And so women who lead, in a very stereotypically masculine way, where they've adapted themselves to a very masculine organization, they get labeled your favorite B word. Bossy, not the other one. And then if they lead in a much more stereotypically feminine way, then they're not seen as strong leader material. This is more participative, more collaborative. And so they get into this double bind, whereas, you know, as men, we have a lot more flexibility when it comes to our leadership style, right? And how we do that, despite the fact that there are more stereotypes around that as well for men. Yeah, what we find is that in performance reviews, the minute you get to the managerial or the leadership levels in an organization, so if you look at McKinsey's Women in the Workplace studies, and they talk about the broken rung theory, and you look at the first step or the second step of where women get into these leadership roles, this is where we see it start to fall apart. Why? Because there's more subjectivity. This is where bias begins to operate. And we found, you know, in lots of studies, including our own, where there's gender differences in the subjective language we use to describe men and women in their leadership evaluations, their performance evaluations. And the question is, you know, at the end of the day, it'd be like, well, okay, not a big deal, except for the fact that it is associated with promotion opportunities. It's associated with pay and incentives and bonuses. So as you start to look at, well, how does the gender wage gap, or how does the lack of representation of women in our senior leadership ranks in our organizations, how is that systemic? Well, there you go, right? It's these these perceptions play out. They play out in subjective performance reviews and evaluations, and it leads to these promotion opportunities or lack thereof for women. Until recently, you know, we didn't have that direct connection in terms of the value proposition between a performance review and you know, the subjective difference in language that women and men receive. And there was a recent study out of Stanford where they found the value proposition, where they found the value difference in terms of some language. We talk about men as visionaries, we talk about men as geniuses. Those things are connected to promotion opportunity. Those are words that we don't use to describe women as often. It's hard to find those in a performance review. And things like potential, you see that all the time. For men, you don't see it for women. And again, these are connected to the opportunities. These are how, and if we're in a meritocratic organization, I'm not looking for that. I don't see it because, oh no, it's meritocratic. So therefore we don't have to go looking for it. So again, there is some tyranny, right? There's a little paradox in terms of we would all like to value a meritocratic ideal, but the challenge is there that we know that, again, nothing's perfect and there are flaws in the system.
I know Michelle and Vicky wanted to jump in on this question as well. Maybe Michelle first and then Vicky.
Yeah, so look, I've got I think quite a different take from David on this. So as a feminist researcher, for me, meritocracy don't exist. It's absolute nonsense. So organizations are gendered. And the starting point for tackling gender inequality is recognizing how they're gendered. What do we mean by gendered? Well, we mean they were built by and for men. And the idea being that in workplaces, we value men and masculinity more than women and femininity. And how that shows up is our shared perceptions of what good looks like was built with this 1950s dominant, assertive, aggressive, what we call success prototype in mind. And how does that show up in your workplace to create inequality? Well, it shows up in my research in 4 ways, right? It shows up in the policies we've got, which is most policies designed with this ideal in mind, which is why we've got to add a mat leave policy in, add a flexible work, because we never designed it with difference in mind. Processes, how we hire, develop, reward, promote, all of that reinforces people who fit that ideal. And then if we look at practices, the behaviors we engage in every day, all aligned to the ideal. Research by Bain shows 97% of organizations today have this deeply ingrained prototype. What does that mean? That means when you enter your workplace, you are faced through your socialization into your organization to become aware that to fit in, to succeed, to advance, you've got to adhere to those behaviors. And yes, that creates a lot of challenges for women. It also creates a ton of challenges for men. And it's compounded by all areas of difference. And what it comes down to, the final P, is really our shared personal beliefs about what good looks like. So for me, the shift that has to happen in organizations is to recognize that we've got to ditch this idea of what good looks like, redefine it, become a truly value-based organization. That's the shift from prototype to value-based. I don't think we'll ever get to a meritocracy because the value is we're all different, right? And until we recognize how we devalue difference and how our workplaces are hardwired to devalue difference and how that means success discriminates, we're never going to create opportunities in terms of equity around access to opportunities, but also experiences. You know, one of the quotes that is so misogynistic that often gets pandered around, I won't say by who, but a lot of people watching this will know, is that, you know, it's not about equitable access to outcomes. It's about equitable access to opportunities. And what we're really saying is that, you know, men are in those positions, got there because somehow they're just better than women. And that's absolute nonsense. If you buy into a meritocracy, that's what you're saying. And so for me, that's highly offensive. All the research shows on pretty much most managerial and leadership capabilities, men and women rate women higher. So, you know, women are graduating with more degrees than men. So you look at all the areas where women should be outperforming men, they don't. Why? Because workplaces don't work for women. They were never designed for women, and they devalue women's capabilities. You know, if you take a common barrier women encounter, like the performance tax, women have to work twice as hard as the average male to be seen as just as good. And that affects access in terms of succession planning, promotion opportunities, leadership opportunities. So for me, like getting to know the barriers is how we start to understand how is inequality showing up, how are workplaces hardwired to be unequal. And in recognizing there is no meritocracy, it's a myth. You know, you didn't get to that position solely based on your capability is one of the hardest things to own. because what we're really saying is actually you've had some luck in the sense that you fitted the prototype. I can own that based on my race, based on my physical, mental ability, based on my sexual orientation. I can own that in all areas, and we need men to do that when it comes to gender.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, this echoes very much what Sandal was saying on different issues. But Vicky, you wanted to chime in as well?
Yeah, going back to the language, right? So you have women sitting in leadership positions where they're like raising funds, allocating funds, you know, digging into like the organizational structure. And when you're giving like the end of the year results, it's like the women, they give so much love and they give so much warmth. So, you know, the way you're describing the goals they're meeting, they like reduce it, I say, to like the level of a heater, you know? And when you see really like data-based impact, it's in the numbers, but when you translate it into the language, then suddenly we're reduced to something super like cuddly, right? And what I see in community-based, which is really something that's not very good for the members who are there to serve, is that women tend to look for tables of only women. So like the Women's Zionist Organization or Women's Philanthropy, because that's where you flow and you're being valued. And so you're seeing women in leadership situations looking for tables that, you know, are only women, which I do say there are moments where it's much easier and much more effective in getting done what you need to be done, but that's not the goal. I mean, we really need to be able to serve our people the best way, which is in tables that have inclusion and diversity. But when you have that kind of language describing, you know, the impact of women, then you're just reducing it. And really it's like it's an unfair playing field, because you can never really describe the impact of women, you know, breaking barriers in terms of numbers by calling them, you know, warm and loving. I think that's one of the challenges I felt a lot in these faith-based organizations with women leadership.
It's very interesting. And I really certainly do not want to suggest that there are tips and tricks that are easy to implement. I understand that, or I think I understand that the common standards that many organizations are using is probably wrong. At the same time, Michelle, David, Vicky, you've been around. You've seen a number of organizations. You've consulted for organizations. You've advised organizations. You've been in faith-based organizations. There must be ways to start engaging that are different from awareness raising. You know, imagine that awareness was raised, and I understand it's not. What would be the first steps that could be taken, especially in faith-based organizations? And I'm going to add a complexity here. In certain faith-based organizations, there's a lot of openness to change. But we also need to recognize that for some of those faith-based organizations, there are also other aspects, not leadership, but other aspects of the service. For example, in Orthodox Jewish circles, you know, it would be the same in certain Muslim communities. There are certain things that are done in a certain way and that the whole community wants to keep without necessarily losing the ability to innovate when it comes to women's leadership in their organizations. Can you share with us maybe slightly more concrete tips based on your experience, whether that is with, you know, men taking a specific role or with a first step being, you know, the implementation of quotas? I don't know, something that you think is very, very important based on what you've seen. I'm happy to take the first one who opens their mic. Vicky.
Hi. Okay. This one's right up my alley. I think, like I said before, fear sometimes, you know, makes you make emotional decisions. That fear of change is the first stop. And I think that's kind of something good in the sense that if we stop and look and to see what is it that we want for organizations in the next 20, 40, 50 years, if there's something in, let's say, at least the Jewish religion that that has been great, and that's why we're here, is that it's been able to adapt without losing the essence. You know, right now in the high holidays, we don't all go to Jerusalem and, you know, make sacrifices of animals. The way we live our religion nowadays is very different than what we did a long time, you know, 100, 200, 300, 500, 1,000 years ago. And that's why we're here. So to understand that adaptability and flexibility is the way to make sure that we still exist for the next couple of generations. It's not the fear of that type of change. And there's also, it's very important to understand there's two different things. In an organization, in a synagogue, there's going to be the denomination, whether you're Orthodox, you're conservative, you're Reform, and then there's the administrative part, right? And many times, because of the fear of changing the administrative part, then we're putting in jeopardy the religious part, because if you have a community and people don't participate and people would say, you know, they're not being kosher and they're not using the mikveh if you're in an Orthodox organization, you're failing, you know, by your rigidity. So it's really important to understand that part of our leadership is understanding where to be flexible. Without that flexibility, we will not survive. That is part of the journey we've been on. That's part of what makes us who we are. We can't be afraid of it. We have to embrace it. And you know, pick and choose where are we going to start that is comfortable enough, with a minimum of, you know, respect and inclusion, without necessarily having to change our whys. You know, why are we here? What's our purpose? What's our mission? And I do feel that if you know, turn it around and see that perspective, we're going to see that the only way really to reach our goals as an organization is to be able to make changes. Without making changes, you know, we're via extinction, and it's in the numbers.
So talking about those changes, you know, maybe Michelle and then David.
Sure, I think from a workplace perspective, what I would share and ask people to consider is, you know, what's the problem you're trying to solve for? And for me, I'm actually not particularly interested in diversity, equity, or inclusion. And the reason I say that is they are outcomes of workplace cultures that value difference. So you can have a workplace that's diverse but not inclusive. You can have a workplace that's inclusive but not diverse, diverse and inclusive but not equitable. It goes on and on. And so for me, the reality is how do you get there? And how do you create an environment, a culture that values difference? I think the starting point is recognizing, and it's what most organizations don't do, that leaders drive culture through the behaviors they reward, support, engage in, endorse, model. And culture creates people's lived experience of inequalities, because culture is really just made up through the behaviors all of us engage in. And so recognizing that all change starts with leaders is important. And what I mean by that is if you're a leader in whatever organization you're working in, I want you to listen up. What we're saying is that people's experiences of inequality is a direct result of your leadership. Every day you get to decide not only who's on your team, but how they're going to be valued, what their lived experience is going to be. And tackling inequality is, without ever having to experience it, is probably one of the greatest privileges leaders face. So for me, it's recognizing that building a workplace that values difference is a privilege, and you get to do that as a leader. So gender equality is really an invitation for leaders to lead. And if your business is going to start anywhere, start investing in building leaders' awareness and understanding and holding them accountable for the action that they're taking or not taking, and recognize that this is how we drive cultural change. And it is about the culture of organizations that devalue difference. And I just want to say, you know, I've worked around the world in different contexts, and regardless of your faith, regardless of your orientation, you know, whatever your identity is, the one thing around the world that unites every single person is the universal need to be yourself at work and to be valued for that. And that is something every single one of us can get behind. But we've got to recognize that creating that type of workplace starts with every single one of us taking accountability. And it starts with organizations holding leaders accountable for the culture they create. So if your business wants to start anywhere, you can carry on with the initiatives that we know are only slightly effective at best, but start with your leaders. And the fact that men make up most leadership positions today, start with men in those positions of leadership. You know, enroll David in your organization and helping you raise men's awareness, help men understand of how they're creating inequality and how they can take action. Sorry, David, I just got you a whole bunch of work, but I really mean that. I think that's the starting point for how we enroll most leaders today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Accountability got to be part of the solution here. And this is, it's interesting when you go into organizations and we talk about building awareness, and often people feel, I think men especially have experienced this in a way where they feel like they're being blamed or shamed for this. And it's like, no, we're just here to create the accountability. There's nothing to be gained by blaming and shaming people for where they are today, but we are going to hold you accountable for the change that we're looking for here. And so as you begin to clarify what it is we're trying to accomplish, we need to hold leaders accountable all the way. The same way, senior leaders haven't, their pay is organized in terms of incentive structures. And I mean, do we do the same thing from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective? And then do we hold them accountable for achieving those results? Because if we don't hold the leaders accountable, there's no incentive to create the change in their behaviors. And at the end of the day, we've got to drive this all the way down through the organization. So start at the top, but drive it down through the organization, especially to those senior managers out there that are probably the ones, the frontline managers who connected and touching more people every day in their organizations, both internal and external to the organization. They're the ones that we really need to have buy into this. And if it's not a priority, if they're not being held accountable, guess what? The work's just never going to get done. They're not going to change their behavior because there's no reason to do that. What has worked well. They're busy. They don't have time. The status quo is going to work for them, and the change isn't going to happen unless we hold them accountable. So we got to do that. One of the ways that you can build this accountability into organizations that works really well, and we're seeing more and more of this happen at all sorts of different levels, all the way up to kind of as we think about kind of a national or more of a global level as well, is you think about transparency. And okay, so how well are you doing at this? And are we being publicly transparent in terms of public disclosure about some of these goals that we have that we're trying to achieve out there? And countries today holding companies responsible, states in the United States holding organizations accountable, and in a variety of different ways that we're doing that. Inside your organization, when you hold business managers accountable for doing this work, it builds this transparency, builds trust, because people inside the organization go, okay, I know what we're doing. I know why we're doing it. I know how well we're doing at it. So it builds trust with people because they understand why we're trying to achieve this. And then again, from an external perspective, I think this is important too for our organizations, because people outside are looking at your organization and how well do you portray this, whether it's through your website or your strategic communications or whatever the platform is you use to communicate this. How are you showing people how well you're doing at this? Because investors are looking at it. The diverse talent that you're looking to hire, that again, every company out there is talking about today, they're looking, are you walking the talk? I see you saying these things, but what are you actually doing? How well are you progressing? And how easy is it to find that information about your company? Because again, with the internet today, people have access and they want to see how well you're doing at it. So we've got to begin to build in the accountability and the transparency.
Thank you so much. This is actually very inspiring, and it is very important to talk about the first steps that we could take. We're moving into the second part of this discussion, and I would urge anyone either in the Q&A or following us on Facebook or on social media more generally to please submit any questions that you want, and I will try my best, even though we have received a few already, to try and ask those questions to our panelists. We've received a few already. One that has been touched on, but maybe we could expand on it a little bit, is from Paulette Jean-Marie, and she asked whether we feel that inequality is more present in the Jewish and Arab world than in other places. I think Vicky, this one, at least at first, is for you, but I would really welcome input from Michelle and David from experiences in different parts of the world.
Most of my experience has been within the Jewish community, so I have a limited perspective. I do have to say that a lot of what happens within faith-based organizations is a reflection of what's happening in the culture of the country where you're at. So it's very hard to generalize. You know, countries that tend to have more inequality of women, you see that reflected in their communities. In communities that come from, let's say, countries like Aleppo that tended to be more male-based, you're going to see that reflected. So I think it has to do really with the time you're at, the country you're at, the city you're at, what's happening around you, and how easy is change in the culture of where you're at. Because people, you know, they're participating in their workplace or in their communities, but they're part of a bigger society. And if that society embraces change, innovation, adaptability, it's more of a chance that you're going to be able to lean into it than the ones who tend to be more rigid and kind of sticking where they, you know, where they're safe spaces. Because sometimes there's a saying, you know, that says, I'd rather something that's bad that I already know than the uncertain. So they'd rather stay there. And I think that has to do a lot with depending the country and the community where you're at.
So would you say, you know, Michelle or David, that in certain countries you've also experienced that difference in culture that affected your work?
So I have lived and worked in everywhere. So Syria, Libya, Malaysia, the Netherlands, the United States, New Zealand, South Africa, you name it. And the thing that I've consistently found is that gender inequality specifically is everywhere, right? And the reason for that, why it's a universal difference we all understand, is because, you know, throughout human history, and I share this in my book, if you go right back to sort of very beginning of the agricultural revolution and how work was divided up, we valued men and masculinity more than women and femininity. And the one thing archaeologists can't explain is why it is globally with communities that had nothing in common, that belief was shared, that belief was formed. That's one of the great mysteries of the patriarchy. And so what's interesting is we have to recognize that this shows up everywhere. It might look a little different, it might present a little different, it might feel a little different, but fundamentally one of the universal forms of inequality is that we value men and masculinity more than women and femininity. And I think for the longest time, the framing of that has been, look at the cost that has on women. And I think, you know, what's so great about common research today, and really where the feminist movement is at, is recognizing that it's not just from a gender perspective, that actually all forms of inequality are perpetuated by this belief that we uphold. And what we need to do is recognize how tackling gender inequality actually helps to tackle all forms of inequality. And actually, you know, starting with gender inequality is a great place, and recognizing how that looks and feels a little different for all individuals and why it costs men is something that ultimately everybody can get behind. And I think for me, one of the frustrations of seeing this truly at a global level, having worked in all these places, is every country somehow thinks they've got, you know, they've got claim to gender inequality, or they've got claim to racism, right? And, you know, I grew up in South Africa during apartheid. And so I think it's really important to recognize that this is universal and it shows up a little differently in every country. And our job is to really understand, what does that look like in your context? And how is it that actually there's a commonality that unites all of us? And how freeing women from outdated gender norms and stereotypes actually serves to free men and free all individuals. And I always say, you know, equality, gender equality is freedom. It's the freedom to be yourself and be valued for that. And it's a freedom every single one of us want. So for me, that's kind of my take on the universal side of it.
Very interesting. So there's a universal problem and a universal quest for freedom. So maybe we can tackle it from that perspective. But David, do you have a different experience?
No, much like Michelle and Vicky, you know, I've worked and lived in lots of different countries around the world, lots of different cultures, and I completely agree with Michelle that, you know, one of the commonalities you find in all of these different cultures are a lot of these very specific aspects around gender. And, you know, as a sociologist, I tend to look at this more around my focus around my work around gender roles, and specifically around how that and how power is infused into those roles. And, you know, which is why I think one of the solutions, the broader solutions, and again, it varies by culture, it can vary by religion, by region, the society, the area that you live, is that, you know, we've got to begin to think about, all right, so if we're going to create equity, true equity and valuing difference in the workplace, we have to start at home, and we can't do one without the other. And a lot of this begins at home. how we socialize people, how we organize, what's the norm and what's the expectation around this in the home. And so for much of the Western society, women do, and it's true of other societies as well, women has done for a long time, twice as much, if not more than twice as much of the domestic labor, right? The unpaid work that men do not value. And is not valued in the same way. This work, is not valued in the same way as men's work, the paid work of the workplace. And if we're ever going to get to true equity, we've got to begin to acknowledge that we as allies at home have to be doing our fair share, whatever that looks like. Equitable, equal, I don't know, equal varies on what time of day it is maybe, but certainly equitable in terms of where we are and supporting our partners' careers. If men are not doing their fair share at home and not supporting their partners' careers, it's like, how are we ever going to get there? And, and certainly I think the pandemic was an opportunity to really, see what was going on. It was exacerbated in so many ways to women were doing almost 3 times as much of the labor, as we found a lot of the research, when you start to add in the homeschooling as well. And so as we think about where do we begin to create equity in the workplace, we have to think about the effect it's having in the home. And again, this gets back to culture and to religion and to tradition and to the societies that we're living in. And what's, as we begin to change things at home, how is that changing things in the workplace? Because as men step up and start and have the opportunity to really be an all-in equal ally at home, it's going to change their behavior in the workplace, right? They're going to value things differently in the workplace. And suddenly, when it's time, when they have a responsibility and it's their turn to, they've got to stay home with a sick kid and take time off from work and miss meetings and important things that are going on, instead of slinking out the back door like we've done for decades, we're actually going to leave loudly. We're going to step up and go, hey, I got to go. I'm not going to be in tomorrow for these meetings because my child's sick and I got to go do this, and I'll catch up with you in another day. Because that begins to normalize different behavior in the workplace. We get past some of these stigmas about what it means to be men and women and these gender roles in the workplace. And we begin to normalize that for junior men as we begin to do it as senior men in the organization. And it normalizes it for women as well. Again, when they're doing their caregiving. And then the part at home as parents. And I love the research around this as parents, for the dads out there that are doing this work at home, and you're being, again, a very visible all-in equal ally and doing the work at home. And that's not just the taking kids to practice, but that's also doing the caregiving around the relationships that you're having. You're doing some of the emotional, cognitive labor of the keeping track of things and organizing things at home. But our kids, our sons are more likely to have more inclusive perspectives of what gender roles look like. So they're going to combine work and family differently when they get to the workplace. And for our daughters, more likely to persist in their goals, reach those career goals and dreams out there, and to enter into non-traditional professions and industries. So if we're looking to create parity and equity, right, we've got to think about the role and the responsibility that we have in doing this at home at the same time we're doing it in the workplace.
Yeah, and doing it at home and at the workplace as a parent and as a professional, there's so many different aspects. It could be seen as sometimes overwhelming to everyone involved. And so I'm wondering whether there are ways, we have a couple of questions about this, about concrete tips, the Jewish Diplomatic Corps, which is the flagship, one of the flagship programs of World Jewish Congress, has adopted the panel pledge, for example. And so, it's one step to try and increase the representation of women in leadership positions and in speaking engagements. But at the same time, we feel that it's probably not enough. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is metrics. And I'm wondering whether there are any metrics, what are the most useful metrics that we could use to collect and facilitate bringing about change in one organization. Michelle, you seem to be having an opinion.
Johan, you have touched on a hot topic, and we have like 11 minutes left, and I'm trying not to rant. So I never had a view on targets and quotas, so just full disclaimer. And then I undertook my research with over 100,000 data points. I have a very strong view on quotas and targets. So I often get asked by organizations, can we just have a target? Can we just have a quota? We want to put this in place. And it's now one of the go-to strategies for tackling this problem, right? And I just want to share with your audience why that can be very damaging. And it's damaging because it actually doesn't solve the problem of inequality, right? Just because you bring diversity in doesn't mean it's going to be valued. And it creates this tokenistic effect for women in particular when they're put into leadership positions. And it actually exacerbates the problem. So research finds when you put one woman into a leadership position, you are 50% less likely to put another one in because you've hit a quota. And even if you don't have a hard quota, there's a thing called implicit quotas where you're like, we've got the woman. And I've experienced this firsthand. So I'll have companies say to me, hey, we solved the gender problem. We now need to move to race. What are you saying? Like there's some imaginary hierarchy we work through. And when you say you solve women, you're meaning white women. So like, this is really ugly. And like, who gets to say how many women is an acceptable number? Why is it 20%? Why is it 30%? Right now we have 80% men. Should we put a cap on that and say, actually, we only allow 20% white men in the organization? Like it's highly offensive. And so for me on representation is an outcome. It's the scoreboard. It's not the game. It's an outcome of cultures that value difference. Your job as an organization is to create an environment where difference can thrive and to start hiring individuals that reflect the communities that you serve, because that is the goal. And so for me, it is something organizations need to track and measure and understand, but the way in which we are approaching targets has a hugely detrimental impact on actually devaluing difference and actually making men feel like, this is a zero-sum game, and it actually does nothing to solve inequality. And one of the other challenges with it is when we put people from underrepresented groups, cut, copy, and paste them into a role, what research finds often we hold those people accountable for changing the culture. Well, we know women can't solve inequality they don't create. So what happens is women undertake all the DEI initiatives. And then what research finds is we rate their performances lower because we see them as engaging in nepotism and, advocating for issues that are in their interest. And men who we actually need to undertake those initiatives who don't, but when they do, research finds their performance is enhanced. They get higher ratings. Because now they're taking up the DEI mantle, right? So for me, the whole thing is flawed. It's really a flawed game. And the worst part about it is I've had women say to me, hey, Michelle, we have to do it. We have to put quotas in because there's no other way we'll affect change. Well, the moment you're saying that, that's the problem we've got to solve for. If we're at the point where you have to mandate targets and quotas because there's no other way to create a culture that values different, surely that's the problem to solve for, because getting you into that organization, your experience is going to be horrible. And if you're a leader listening to this rant, it's really important to recognize that if you want to hire Black women in your organization, if you want to hire even white women, racial minority women, it doesn't matter. If you don't know what their lived experience is going to be, you have absolutely no business hiring women into your organization. You have to be accountable for creating an environment that values their difference. So hot button, I will pause now. Rant.
Oh, but that is perfect. The rant was due, and it's good to hear. I would like to take some time to have closing remarks by Sonat Bernecker-Hart, the chair of our of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps, and I would love to hear from her. But at the same time, I want to give a chance, maybe 1 minute to Vicky and David to maybe say one word about what do you think is the key topic that we should take home. I've written leadership, transparency, accountability. What is it for you, David?
Those are all big ones. But I think at the end of the day, the thing that changes behavior is there's got to be, and whether you think of it as an incentive, but there's got to be an impetus to create change, right? To change something that has worked. I'm going to, talking about men here, something that has worked for us for so long, right? And so what's my impetus for change? And so we have to think about what is it that's going to create that change, that we can hold them accountable for doing that work out there. And I think that, again, understanding how we value difference in our organization and how we can hold men accountable for doing that work is really important. So I think building that awareness, around this is really important.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, David. Vicky, one word to close it off before we take it to Sonnet?
I think creativity. We have to be very creative in revolution. We need to change the education system, the work system, the health system, and our faith-based organizations have to be innovative and creative to be able to attract diversity and to attract the best leadership in order to best serve our people.
Thank you, Vicky. Sonat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Johan. It's an honor to be with all of you today. And on behalf of the World Jewish Congress and everyone who has helped to organize this session, I want to thank everybody. And I would also like to thank the Commission on the Status of Women for allowing this session. And what's interesting is that the workplace is such an important part of this whole question. So many people are in corporations, and if we think about today, 100 of the largest economies in the world are corporations, 49 are nation states. And with this, the corporation or the workplace is where one can gain a lot of information, is to start making the efforts that we've been calling for in this discussion, to start doing the work. It happens at the workplace. I know as a leader of a company myself, that when we have these conversations, many of my team members think about them and we discuss them and they say, I'm going to be thinking about this when I go home. And so when David spoke about the importance of it also being simultaneously in the workplace and the home, I think that that's absolutely right, and that they work together collaboratively to hopefully bring us closer to creating a greater understanding and appreciation of difference. And I think about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the late rabbi, who wrote a book called The Dignity of Difference, in which he states it's actually a huge imperative for us today, for our society and our culture, to create a paradigm that enlarges and not diminishes difference and makes us understand the importance of it, because that will make the world truly a better place, and create a place for everyone, and understand the importance of how working together can help us reach those goals. I was thinking a lot about what was said with regard to, the difficulties within the religious realm, but certainly also equal differences of equal difficulties on the workplace. And there's a story of a rabbi. He was called the Tzaddik of Jerusalem, and his wife, she had an injury on her foot, and he went with her, supported her, went with her to the doctor, and the doctor was looking at them, and he said, "Our foot is hurting." And I think that that's an interesting way to look at it, is that when there's a problem, it doesn't just affect the person or the group that is having the problem, it actually affects us all. And I really want to thank Vicky and Michelle and David for making this so apparent, how this is really a problem that we all need to address together, because in not addressing it, it certainly hurts us all. So thank you everyone for being a part of this session. And I look forward to doing more work. And I hope that this inspired us all to work towards a greater understanding of the dignity of difference.
Thank you so much, Sonat. This has been very inspiring to me, and I hope that it was for our audience as well. There's only one thing left to do, which is thanking you for participating. Thank you, Vicky, David. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sonat. I wish you all the best, and we'll close the session now. Thank you very much.